A candle smokes above the table. Dried sand stains darken the parchment, and an oak chest with seals stands in the corner. At the same time, in the halls where the walls are covered with fabrics, courtiers retell stories about how games of rules decide the fate of the heart. On one table lie lists of crops, marriage certificates, and guardians' oaths. On another, poems about the choice of mercy. Between them is not a bridge, but a chasm. One life is lived like an account book, the other like a ritual. Dear viewers, welcome. Write to us about where you are watching from and how rumors of honor intertwine with real contracts in your cities. Share your views on what is stronger, paper or poetry, in the comments. Make yourselves comfortable and enjoy listening. The history of the 22nd century at the court of the great lords is conveniently described with flowers and fabrics, but it is much harsher to the touch. Eleanor of Aquitaine is a figure surrounded by legends of courts of love. This is the name given to secular games in which ladies and courtiers supposedly considered disputes over the right to favor according to sets of rules. These games embellished conversations and created a fashion for wit and discipline of the senses. But the archives of Aquitaine and Normandy contain another fabric of the era. Marriage contracts with lists of land, duties, and debts of heirs. There is no place for rhyming arguments in these pages, but there are incomes from mills, parts of vineyards, rights of way, and lists of guarantors. When marriage was seen as a union of estates, it was not the troubadour, but the notary, who took center stage. In court culture, the rules of love are carried from hall to hall like an embroidered coverlet, which is beautiful but cold to sit on. Meanwhile, chaplains, judges, and clerks working in dioceses and city curias recorded other things: the consent of the bride and groom, the size of the dowry, the conditions for the return of property upon divorce, and a list of witnesses. Consent is the key word, recognized not by flowery speech, but by testimony and signs. Who was present at the conclusion? Whose hands held the charters? What seal left wax? And although court games teach the art of capturing the heart, they do not decide what share remains for the wife if the husband disappears or breaks his vow, and who takes on the debts of the family. The myth of courts of love promises that an elegantly formulated argument can change the outcome. The document shows the stubborn logic of the age: only records, witnesses, and current norms. The chronicles contain stories of contests of wit, but at the same time, in the same lands, there are canonists who settle disputes about the validity of marriage and inheritance without frills. In treatises on marriage written at court, the focus is not on enthusiasm, but on the form of the oath, the degree of kinship, forbidden days, compensation for damages to the parties, and custody of children. City statutes work in the same way. They establish the order of issuing dowries in parts, penalties for breaking agreements, deadlines for returning pledges, and the sequence of appeals to the judge. In the register, Each name is surrounded by numbers translated into words and ownership marks. A theater is carefully formed around Eleanor, in which the lady becomes the arbiter of taste and manners. But this theater does not coincide with the legal system. In land disputes, the name of the great lady appears on letters confirming grants, protecting the rights of monasteries and vassals, and listing villages, incomes, and boundaries. In the same folders are letters about dowries, specifying the weight of silver and payment terms. When poetry collections with rules of love entered the court, petitions for confirmation of the alienation of fiefs were brought to the chancellery on the same days. If one world gave rise to legends, the other world demanded seals. Court games were a form of social selection. They distributed attention and favor, set prestigious topics of conversation, and gathered around them those who were skilled with words. But the merging of the two worlds, words and seals, was rare, and most often took the form of parallel movements. A marriage concluded to music was confirmed on parchment. If a dispute arose, the game had no weight. When relatives presented their accounts, it was not a ballad that began, but a collection of evidence. Rivals in love stories disappeared from the records, and in their place came guardians, managers, and guarantors. In episodes where rumors attempted to destroy honor, lawyers sought not poetry, but facts. Was there an oath? Who confirmed it? Was the blood barrier broken? Were the fasting days of marital cohabitation observed according to church discipline? And how were property rights distributed? This fork becomes especially noticeable when studying specific months and years of the reign, when large estates changed owners and cash flows crossed borders. Dowries often became a bargaining chip between families, and widows' shares became the subject of protracted litigation. The court records, where such cases were heard, featured adult women with legal capacity, their representatives, witnesses, and notaries. They brought receipts, clarified lists of items issued, demanded the return of deposits, and pointed out abuses by guardians. All this took place alongside the halls where playful disputes over the right to mercy were played out. But when an estate, a mill, and a vineyard were at stake, it was not the orator who decided, but the court. To understand why the myth has lasted so long, one need only look at the benefits it brought. The legend of the courts of love served the prestige of the court, demonstrating the subtlety of customs and the hidden hierarchy of favors. It gave form to conversations where everyone could sparkle without directly touching on issues of power and property. It diverted attention from the accounting of marriage, where every line could become a cause for conflict between families. The myth allowed people to talk about desire safely, turning it into an exercise in style. The document, on the other hand, demanded responsibility, naming names, confirming facts, making decisions that would have to be lived with. In this tension, Eleanor turns out to be not the Queen of Hearts, but the keeper of the balance between the visible and the recorded. Her era gave Europe an image of secular elegance, but also cemented the power of parchment. In the fragile light of a candle, poetry collections seem brighter than accounting books. But when the candle goes out, the seals remain, and they decide who owns the house, who gets a share of the harvest, and who is responsible for paying off the family debt. This is how poetry and the notary coexist. The former enchants, the latter distributes. Following the traces of parchment, the picture becomes even denser. Dowries and widows' shares were not beautiful figures from ballads. They were sums and plots of land, divided by boundaries, streams and roads, written down point by point. While the court argued over the right to favor, notaries in the cities of Aquitaine and Anjou were measuring plots of vineyards and calculating revenues from bridge tolls. Marriage was not marked by poetry, but by a list of property brought into the home and the obligations assumed by both parties. If the husband went on a long campaign, the manager brought records of the collection of rents, and the bride's relatives made sure that the agreed-upon parts of the dowry were returned when necessary. Complaints from adult women about non-payment and delays by guardians also flowed in. These cases show how smoothly and efficiently the legal system worked. The names of witnesses, places, dates, lists of items and animals, the cost of each item, and next to them, the signature of the scribe, recording the agreement and obligation. When it is said that Eleanor's court had a court of love, where ladies decided the fate of hearts, it is important to understand what exactly was meant by a court. It was a secular game, a collection of rules of wit and rituals of behavior useful for maintaining hierarchical discipline and channeling tensions. It gave form to the discussion of desires without directly touching on the dispute over inheritance. While poets exercised their subtleties, lawyers dealt with real cases in parallel. The validity of marital consent, impediments to kinship, errors of form, breach of promises, and compensation for damages to the parties. And while in court circles the right to mercy could be recognized on the basis of verbal dexterity, in the city curia, a document confirmed by witnesses was requested, and checks were made to ensure that church deadlines and parish discipline had been observed. This dual perspective explains why the myth of courts of love seems vivid, but is rarely found in recorded decisions. It coexisted with the law, but did not replace it. Among the papers associated with the name of Eleanor, there are not only grants and patronage of monasteries, but also letters confirming the position of the spouse as an authorized party. These formulations reveal the maturity of the participants in the disputes. They act through representatives. They dispose of parts of the property by agreement. They present receipts. They insist on the fulfillment of the conditions for the distribution of the dowry in shares. Their voices are heard not in the halls of court entertainment, but in the corridors, where the smell of wax, dust, and wet wool mantles hangs in the air. It is there that it becomes clear that honor is not a poetic image, but the creditworthiness of a family, access to loans, and reputation as a guarantee of the fulfillment of obligations. Rumors can deprive a family of access to credit, and then plans for sowing crops and purchasing salt collapse. Therefore, families defended their honor not with ballads, but with facts, witness testimony, copies of receipts, and records of the issuance of half of the dowry within the agreed time frame. In court descriptions, women appear as arbiters of taste, but in notarial books, they are bearers of rights. If the husband violated the terms, the wife's family demanded the return of the dowry or part of it, and this process followed an established procedure. Consent was seen as a mutual obligation, the boundaries of which were determined by church discipline, the usual terms of cohabitation, and the practice of local courts. When discord arose, no one called a troubadour. They sought out the people who had been present when the vows were taken, checked the accuracy of the formula, and ascertained whether there had been any deception regarding kinship, or whether church prohibitions on certain days had been violated. If a defect in form was found, the marriage was declared contestable or invalid. If there was no defect, the parties were obliged to fulfill the agreement or compensate for the violation. All this does not fit into the framework of courtly games, but it was precisely this that determined the fate of houses. The political dimension reinforces the contrast. Eleanor is the nexus between estates, dynastic projects, and the cultural scene. Around her, a new fashion for talking about manners and feelings is developing. But, at the same time, there is a struggle for fiefdoms, citadels, and coffers. In the years when suzerains changed, when troops marched through the valleys, when revenues from fairs and bridges passed from hand to hand, marriage alliances served a consolidating function. Poetry worked as the lubricant of the court mechanism, and notarial contracts as the screws that held the structure together. If the screws came loose, conflicts arose between families, where neither elegant rules nor praise helped. Only procedure helped, setting a date, summoning the parties, collecting testimony, paying in installments, recording in the book. The procedure could be difficult and ruthless, but it turned vague shame into specific amounts and deadlines. The economy of the court depended on patronage, and the economy of the cities depended on the reliability of contracts. Therefore, the myth of courts of love was beneficial as a showcase. It presented an elegant shell that conveniently concealed the asymmetry of power, the coercion of marriages of convenience, and the need to take into account the interests of the senior lines of the family. When people talked about grace and mercy, they talked less about how brides were given their shares in portions, how widows fought for their due allotments, how guardians dragged out the terms, how merchant houses assessed the degree of risk when working with feudal clients. But in the city books, all this appears in dry lines. So much was given, so much was left in storage, secured by a pledge in the form of a harvest, the guarantee of such and such a person, the term in so many months. The courts of love themselves were reduced to role-playing competitions, where it was not precedents that were examined, but the elegance of the argument. Descriptions of such games have been preserved in individual leaflets, but their influence is limited to the rooms where the courtiers were present. Beyond the doors of these rooms lay the territory of the episcopal and city courts, where any clever move was tested by a simple question. Is there a document? Are there witnesses? Is there a valid norm? This difference reflects the main theme of the century. Poetry helps people live at court, while notaries help people live at home. And while the former shape style, the latter are responsible for bread and walls. The story of Eleanor is convenient for romanticization because it allows us to talk about power through the language of feelings. But chronicles, tax books, and litigation records bring the conversation back to where the harshness of the world is palpable. In the same years when ballads about the virtues of fidelity were sung in the same lands, confiscations took place for failure to perform feudal service. Decisions were made on pledges for non-payment, and attempts by relatives to appropriate a widow's share were recorded. This does not mean that poetry is false. It means that it was not the law. Eleanor, as a symbol, holds both sides, the splendor of the holiday and the weight of the seals. But when the dispute reached the threshold of the court, it was not splendor that decided. This is precisely why the myth is so enduring. It promises that a complex world can be reduced to an elegant formula. The document inevitably reminds us of the opposite. A complex world requires long lines, attentive eyes, and patience. The age of Eleanor left enough traces for us to see this. In one room there are carpets and lutes, in another there are sacks of salt and bundles of keys to barns. Between them walk adults who are accustomed to living not by words, but by receipts, and yet strive to speak of honesty as if it were a song. It is at this crossroads that poetry meets the notary, not to win, but so that everyone can remain true to themselves. One gives the courtly world a soft shell. The other keeps the house in place when the music stops. The traces left in the margins of the registers are particularly indicative of how the everyday machinery of marriage and property worked. Notes about the summons of relatives, the appearance of guarantors, the fact that one of the parties presented a chest with belongings as collateral for the unpaid part of the dowry, where legends about court disputes turned wordplay into a rule. The real order required external signs of good faith, gifts brought before witnesses, coins handed over before the community, records of consent. If one party referred to court custom, the other presented the parish charter or the landowner's letter, according to which they should proceed. Deadlines were set for when marriages could be concluded, and obstacles were listed, which the courts asked about strictly and without ambiguity. All this amounted to a cold sequence of steps. Verify the freedom of the promise, certify kinship, document the dowry, distribute the risks in the event of the death of one of the spouses, and determine the order of return of property. This was the reality faced by adult women and men when poetry gave way to seals. In the court culture associated with the name of Eleanor, it was more convenient to discuss the rules of the heart than the cost of fabrics, keys, tableware, and silver that were part of the dowry. But it was precisely the listing of these items that determined the power of the house. Lists that dryly noted the number of scarves, belts, and ribbons, with each item assigned a market value, allowed the family to remain flexible. If the husband was absent and things were going badly, the bride's relatives could insist on the return of a certain share. If the father died and the land had to be divided, the wife claimed the widow's share that had been agreed upon earlier. Rumors of impropriety in these circumstances did not work. The courts demanded evidence, not hearsay. Any attempt to give the conflict a flavor of insulted love was shattered by the question of boundaries and pledges. Even in homes where songs were known and troubadours were welcomed, matters were based on calculations of income from bridges, salt collection, shop rentals, and the notorious exits, the financial obligations of dependent people who brought into the coffers the very coins that made up the dowries. The discrepancy between myth and document is especially noticeable in situations where families clashed over inheritance. In the imaginary courts of love, one could sue for graceful behavior and compliance with courtly expectations. But the question of inheritance rights always came down to the legal grounds of the marriage bond. If the promise was made without observing the form, if the kinship was close, if there were no witnesses, if the guardian's consent was not given, the marriage was recognized as contestable or void, and the whole structure of honor fell apart. Some families tried to turn loud court conversations to their advantage. They staged contests of wit to give the future union an aura of invincible grace. But as soon as it was necessary to secure the right to land, roads, and mills, scribes appeared at the door, and letters with clear formulas were laid on the table. In those moments, it became clear that romantic truth did not stand up to the test of the sandbox for drying ink. The roles of women within this mechanism went far beyond that of Lady of the Heart. The documents mention adult owners of keys and chests who kept jewelry as liquid assets, guardians who controlled tenants in the absence of their husbands, relatives who sought payments in installments and on time. Their written actions demonstrate their knowledge of the rules and their ability to use the procedure. In the court halls, they could take part in ceremonies, but in the city corridors, they defended property from attempts by distant relatives and creditors, using the language of statutes and records. It is there that the word reciprocity becomes a practice. The exchange of obligations, responsibility for maintaining the home, predictability of payments and returns, distribution of burdens in times of illness and famine. This language lacks glamour, but it holds up the walls. The fiscal dimension of court life should not be underestimated. Rituals and tournaments cost money, and that money came from the estate. When the coffers were empty, families turned to the loan market, and then reputation became collateral. Rumors of excess could bring down the rate, break correspondence with merchants, and delay the delivery of salt and cloth, which affected not just metaphors, but daily bread. In such conditions, the court of love was convenient as a screen. It allowed people to talk about norms of behavior without directly discussing the budget. As soon as a dispute arose over contracts, the frame was removed from the screen and the fabric was folded up. The curia remained on the proscenium. The appointment of the day, the appearance of the parties, the announcement of the act, the list of items, the signatures, and nearby, adult women, outwardly gentle but insistent in their demands, balancing the pressure of the male lines of the family by referring to the law. Examples of competitive circumvention of procedures also appear in cities where people liked to refer to the high protection of the nobility. There, relatives tried to replace the record books with honor, pronouncing symbolic formulas before the community, hoping that they would be heard as a final verdict. But soon, they had to return to the statutes, which already prescribed a sequence of steps. First, secure consent, then confirm ownership, then specify the conditions for return. Some judges tried to hide behind custom, but letters, catalogs of fees and taxes straightened their backs. Evasion did not work. Without sealed documents, without witnesses, without receipts, the mechanism did not move. Thus, the myth of decisions made from the heart gradually faded into the role of a court game, while documentary life continued its slow and inexorable movement, turning pages one after another. When the name of Eleanor appears in the chronicles, it is often accompanied by glowing descriptions. However, everyday records from the same territory tell a different story, one of the persistence of housekeepers, of the patience with which adult women gather the promised portions of their dowries piece by piece, of the never-ending struggle for clarity of boundaries. They do not break the order, they use it and strengthen it. And it is precisely because of this strengthening that legend does not swallow up reality. Court poetry helps the circle of the chosen to live, and notarial formulas ensure the survival of houses, shops, and barns. Between these layers lies a path, along which pages stained with candle soot are carried, bearing neat marks that indicate that the rules of the heart give way here to the rules of record-keeping. While court legends continued to multiply elegant formulas about hearts and graces, lists of obligations grew at the city gates, and it was these that determined the outcome of human stories. The return of dowry shares was recorded in sealed bundles bearing the marks of witnesses. Payment deadlines were indicated not by abstract faithfulness, but by the days of fairs and agricultural cycles. The possibility of terminating a contract was linked to specific force majeure events, such as crop failure or the death of the breadwinner. Within this system, adult women, described as keepers of keys and guardians of chests, acted as the bearers of the household's memory. They knew where the receipts were kept, knew how to check the weight of fabrics and silver, and understood which clause of the contract would help to buy time. It was their presence in the offices that turned the myth of courts of love into a backdrop next to the real scene where the fates of shops and courtyards were decided. Where court gossip tried to label something as indecent, the office routine asked to see an inventory, indicate a price, present witnesses, name a date, and the rumor fell apart because it couldn't meet any of these simple requirements. There were also attempts to circumvent this routine. Families would slip in old papers with cracked seals, refer to the vague custom of our ancestors, and bring moral narratives about women's behavior to the public square, hoping to replace the missing sheet with morality. But even this circumvention had its limits. The statutes explicitly stated that custom without confirmed practice and contradicting the current wording was invalid, and moral noise without reference to property and deadlines was recognized as pressure, which entailed a fine. From time to time, individual judges tried to play on the side of the loud family, replacing the procedure with a hint. Then a slow but persistent movement of complaints began through the stages of the courts, and the higher the complaint rose, the drier the language of the decision became. It reduced the dispute to three things. Was there consent from the adult party? Was the form observed? Were the property clauses secured? Everything else was left for songs. In these decisions, one can hear how adult life, in which every coin is needed for the winter, chooses a document over a stained glass window. A stained glass window is beautiful, but it does not warm the grain. A document is mediocre on the outside, but it holds up the wall. That is why in letters and record books, heartfelt phrases fade faster than the ink that records the size of a widow's share, the price of fabric, and the right to a bridge toll. And when the poets leave, and the sandboxes for pouring sand still hold crumbs from dry lines, it becomes clear that the balanced weight of the house was held not by statements of noble love, but by the silent signatures of adults capable of answering for the term, weight, and price. This does not cancel out the courtly game, but leaves it on its shelf next to other symbols. And on the table remains what survives any winter: fabric, keys, ribbons, payment journals, and next to them, the owners of these items, looking at the ink intently and without illusions. There is no poetry in their gaze, but there is a skill to get back what is theirs without fuss. Perhaps it is this skill that made the legend of the courts of love safe for decorating walls. While the legend hung there, the house continued to breathe the law. This is the main gap between myth and paper, between the troubadour's Aliverdi and the clerk's note about who took on the obligation, when, how it will be fulfilled, and what will happen if it is not. There is no room for random mercy, but there is plenty of room for predictable justice, which slowly but surely grinds even the most famous names into a smooth line in the register. The final touch in this story of court poetry and notarial prose appeared where conflicts reached their limit and threatened to escalate into a family vendetta. Then it was not the troubadour who was brought out into the square, but a list of mutual concessions, and each concession was calculated so as not to upset the balance. No one liked the compromises recorded through the hourglass. Loud relatives complained about the degradation of honor, shopkeepers frowned at the delays, and women, accustomed to holding the keys, understood that some of the chests would be lost, and some of the items would have to be given up. But it was these compromises that saved the walls. They specified the days on which the share had to be returned, recorded in writing the refusal to prosecute, and appointed guarantors whose names were guarantees in themselves in neighboring parishes. And each such sheet, albeit boring, eliminated the most dangerous part of the myth, the temptation to resolve everything instantly, beautifully, without regard for the consequences. A beautiful solution rarely survives the winter. What is written down almost always survives. Thus, the memory of the courtly courts of love remained in the chronicles as a game, a mask, a decorative frame around the everyday mechanism, while the memory of the real outcomes settled in the record books, which continued to be read for years to come. In these books, we see adult men and women making difficult but understandable decisions. To give up a part in order to keep the house, to refrain from loud insults so as not to lose a bridge, to affirm the rights of a widow so as not to destroy the network of obligations that nourish the surrounding villages. And so the legend of Eleanor's decisions of the heart, however vivid, dissolves into a material draft, where there is no place for sudden mercy, but there is room for a procedure tested by time. This is morality without moralizing. The house survives where paper is stronger than song, where adults do not allow someone else's game to replace their rights, where love can exist but does not cancel out the notary. When, at the end of the day, the clerk dries the last paragraph and the hostess takes a bunch of keys from her belt, it becomes clear that the protocol defeated the pamphlet many hours ago. Hearts will continue to love, but the fate of property will be decided by seals. And in this cold but honest finale, a quiet freedom emerges. No one has the right to cover up someone else's property with poetry. No one can turn public credit into a salon toy. And the balance of the home is determined by how carefully adults have recorded the conditions of their lives and consistently fulfill them.